In the last episode of this series, we looked at the idea of making an adjustment, which is a way of changing your posture in the moment. And earlier in the series, we touched on the idea that in order to completely change our posture, we need to change how we gesture, how we move. Most importantly, we need to maintain the lengthening of the torso and the appropriate lengthening and widening of the back while doing basically any activity. Verbal directions are one of the methods we use to implement our model of good posture. But in order to create good directions and know that we're succeeding in implementing those directions, we have to have a good understanding of that model. You may recall our basic guideline is that good posture should allow the mechanisms of the body to function properly, and more narrowly, that our fascia, in order to function, should be taut. We've looked generally at this idea of rotating the pelvis and rib cage in such a manner as to lengthen the torso. Today, we will dig into more specifics around the model of posture that we use. When it comes to the lower back, we want to see a straight line, not a hollowed out, bent back. The back line should be essentially straight from the height of the armpit down to the buttocks. This hollowing that we often see is the result of the rotations of the ribcage and pelvis that bend the back and form this protrusion at the front. But just having a straight lower back alone is not all that meaningful. An individual parameter like this is not sufficient to describe good posture. It's possible to straighten out your lower back by bending your knees or even shortening your torso. But if we add a couple more parameters, we can create a model that's specific enough to demand genuine lengthening of the torso and lengthening of the fascia of the body. When it comes to the rib cage, we want the front of the rib cage to be straight and not angled. You'll find that most people have bent the top of their rib cage back for so long that they've essentially reshaped their rib cage to have a kind of angle at the front. But this can be changed if you stop applying the wrong movements to your rib cage. We want the front of the rib cage to be in line with the front of the pelvis, specifically the point we've called the iliac. We then want all these points to be lined up over the instep, which is a point on the talus bone just at the front of the ankle. This is what Francois Delsarte called the line of unity. But to be clear, the line itself means nothing. This is just a description of what you will see in someone who is actually using their fascia properly and lengthening their torso. There are more parameters I could outline, but these few go a long way and produce a number of implications. For instance, if the frontal plane of your torso is over your instep, then your legs must be straight and not leaning forward at the top as is seen in most people. Your back line will be behind your heels, which may look out of balance, but it's not, because your torso in this configuration is loading your fascia. You are suspending yourself up in the air, using the due tension in the springs that are your fascia. Occasionally, people ask me, well, what about flat back posture? Isn't that considered bad? But if you look at representations of flat back posture, you'll see they do not meet these few criteria that I've laid out. The frontal plane is not over the instep, the upper sternum is pulled back, and the pelvis is forward. Let's look at how this understanding of the model informs our gestures and adjustments. We've been looking at the adjustment to rotate the pelvis, lifting the iliacs back and up away from the knees, while moving the upper sacrum back faster than the lower sacrum. What is the limit to this kind of movement? Well, if you rotate way too far, you will round your back, which goes against the model. In reality, it's also likely that your ribcage would come forward and down if you did rotate that far back with your pelvis. This is not a huge concern in standing, but in sitting, it's something to bear in mind. For a more dynamic gesture, we can look at this image of one of Alexander's early students pushing a lawnmower. We can see that even though he's walking, pushing a somewhat heavy object, and leaning with his torso, he is maintaining the front and back lines of his body. Now, obviously, when the torso is angled, not every point on the frontal plane will be over the instep, but his lower sternum is above the instep of his strong leg. His abdomen is not protruding, and his upper torso is not retracted. This idea of keeping the lower sternum area over the instep is also useful in going to sit or squat. Observation reveals that most people bend their torso even more significantly than usual whenever they do basically anything. People subconsciously or consciously believe that this bending helps them. They might assume it's just how the body is meant to be used. To a certain degree, this flexing of the torso does provide some tension into the musculature. But it's not the correct kind of tension. What happens in this overly flexed configuration is that certain muscles are overused and others are underused, precisely because the musculature is not able to get the leverage needed from the fascia. Remember, your muscles attach to your fascia. When the fascia is not taut, the musculature has to pull the fascia taut before it really gets leverage from the fascia. And so, you end up working harder with your musculature to get less out of it. Over time, these habits form the seemingly permanent, unbalanced posture that is seen in most people nowadays. You also end up pulling yourself into the extremes. Most people can easily pass from protruding their abdomen to rounding their back. It's pretty easy to just release some of your muscles and overwork others to make these extreme postures. But neither of these extremes actually makes your fascia taut. There's another extreme that isn't available to most people in their current state, because to get there, you have to extend your torso in a balanced way, which requires movements that genuinely lengthen you, rather than shorten you by bending one way or the other. Making those movements requires some thought. Now, of course, there are situations where you need to bend your torso for one reason or another. But then the question becomes, what happens after? Do you return to a properly configured torso, or do you stay bent? Most people start bent, bend themselves even more, and then return to their original bend. The idea we're looking at is, how can we rationally guide ourselves back to an unbent torso, even if we have to bend our torso for an extended period? We'll zoom in on the limbs in the next episode of this series. But for now, try to observe yourself. When there's a stimulus in your life, whether you're lifting something heavy, or pulling out your phone, or you're playing an instrument or doing some other kind of hobby that you like, do you habitually shorten your torso? Do you find yourself shortening even more in reaction to a difficult or stressful task? Do you have any directions that you can use to change your response? Observe yourself, then join me next episode, and we'll get into our arms and legs.